Hi aspirants, in my lecture number 16 I will discuss the topic Disaster Management Part 4. The remaining topics will be covered in subsequent videos. This lecture will focus on policy and guidelines on disaster management, national policy and disaster management, Hyogo Framework of Action and Sendai Framework. We will also discuss the question which has appeared in the year 2018. The question says, describe various measures taken in India for disaster risk reduction before and after signing Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030. How is this framework different from Hyogo Framework for Action 2005? Please listen to my lecture carefully. In the course of my discussion, in the course of my lecture, I will discuss this answer to this question as well. First, we will discuss policy and guidelines on disaster management. The national authority under the Disaster Management Act has been mandated with the responsibility for laying down the policies, plans and guidelines for disaster management to ensure timely and effective response to disasters. It is further required to approve the plans prepared by the ministries or departments of the Government of India in accordance with the national plans. The guidelines laid down by the national authority have to be followed by state authorities in drawing up their state plans, and the same is applicable to different ministries and departments of the Government of India for the purpose of integrating the measures for prevention of disaster and the mitigation of its effects in the development plans and projects. The National Executive Committee under the Act has to prepare the national plan, coordinate and monitor the implementation of the national policy. Similarly, the state authority of each state has been entrusted with the responsibility for laying down policies and plans for disaster management for the state under the Act. Now let us discuss the National Policy on Disaster Management. In short, it is NPDM. The National Policy on Disaster Management has been approved by the central government on October 22, 2009 and is circulated to all concerned. The policy envisages a safe and disaster-resilient India by developing a holistic, proactive, multi-disaster oriented and technology-driven strategy through a culture of prevention, mitigation, preparedness and response. The policy covers all aspects of disaster management, including institutional and legal arrangements, financial arrangements, disaster prevention, mitigation and preparedness, techno-legal regime, response, relief and rehabilitation, reconstruction and recovery, capacity development, knowledge management, research and development. It focuses on the areas where action is needed and the institutional mechanism through which such actions can be channelized. The NPDM, that is the National Policy on Disaster Management, addresses the concerns of all sections of the society, including differently abled persons, women, children and other disadvantaged groups in terms of granting relief and formulating measures for rehabilitation of the persons affected by disasters. The issue of equity and inclusiveness has been accorded due consideration. It aims to bring in transparency and accountability in all aspects of disaster management through involvement of community-based organizations, Panchayati Raj institutions, local bodies and civil society. Now we will discuss the question which has appeared in 2018 and has been mentioned at the outset. Let us take the first part of the question. Measures taken in India for disaster risk reduction before signing Sendai Framework. First is, before signing the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction, the Disaster Management Act was enacted in 2005, which ushered in a paradigm shift from a relief-centric, that is a reactive approach, to a more proactive regime that led greater emphasis on preparedness, prevention, and mitigation. Second, the plan also aims at maximizing the ability to cope with disasters at all levels of administration as well as among the communities. Third, the National Policy on Disaster Management has been prepared in pursuance of the Disaster Management Act 2005, which led the framework or the roadmap for handling disasters in a holistic manner. Now we take the B part of that question. Measures taken in India for DRR, that is disaster risk reduction, after signing Sendai Framework. First, India released first ever National Disaster Management Plan, a document based on the global blueprint for reducing disaster losses, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2016. Second, the plan is based on the four priority themes of the Sendai Framework, namely understanding disaster risk, improving disaster risk governance, investing in disaster risk reduction through structural and non-structural measures, and disaster preparedness, early warning, and building back better in the aftermath of a disaster. Third, the plan has a regional approach which will be beneficial not only for disaster management but also for development planning. Fourth, it is designed in such a way that it can be implemented in a scalable manner in all phases of disaster management. Now we move on to Hyogo Framework of Action. What is Hyogo Framework of Action 2005? India is a signatory to the Hyogo Framework of Action and is committed to achieving the goals set under it through systematic and sustained efforts under the 5 priority action areas mentioned in the framework. Representatives from 168 countries participated in the Global Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in January 2005 in Kobe, Japan. The Hyogo Framework of Action 2005 to 2015 was adopted to work globally towards sustainable reduction in disaster losses in lives and in the social, economic, and environmental assets of communities and countries. The framework set 3 strategic goals and 5 priority action areas which has been mentioned. First, we will discuss the 3 strategic goals. Following are the goals as agreed under the Hyogo Framework of Action. First is the more effective integration of disaster risk reduction into sustainable development policies, planning and programming at all levels with a special emphasis on disaster prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and vulnerability reduction. Second, the development and strengthening of institutions, mechanisms, and capacities at all levels, in particular at the community level, that can systematically contribute to building resilience to hazards. Third, the systematic incorporation of risk reduction approaches into the design and implementation of emergency preparedness, response and recovery programs in the reconstruction of the affected communities. Now we will discuss the 5 priority action areas. Under the Hyogo Framework of Action, the following priority areas have been identified for the countries to concentrate in their efforts for making the countries disaster resilient. First, ensure that disaster risk reduction is a national and a local priority with a strong institutional basis for implementation. Second, identify, assess, and monitor disaster risks and enhance early warning. Third, use knowledge, innovation, and education to build a culture of safety and resilience at all levels. Fourth, reduce the underlying risk factors. Fifth, strengthen disaster preparedness for effective response at all levels. Now we'll discuss the key activities. Following key activities are envisaged under this framework. First is promote socio-economic development practices. Second, land use planning and other technical measures. Third, strengthening of institutional and technical capacities. Fourth, review and implement preparedness and contingency plans. Fifth, promote volunteerism and community participation. Sixth, creation of provision of emergency funds. Seventh, dialogue, coordination, and exchange of information between disaster managers and development sectors. India is one of the participating countries and works closely with the UNISDR, that is United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, to implement the priority areas of Hyogo Framework action for disaster risk reduction. There is a biennial monitoring framework developed by United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction and a national progress report submitted accordingly with United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. To implement the framework's activities, a working group has been constituted under the chairmanship of a Joint Secretary, Ministry of Home Affairs. The group comprises representatives from Ministries of Rural Development, Panchayati Raj, Urban Development, Health and Family Welfare, Environment and Forest, Women and Child Development, Earth Sciences, Science and Technology, and also from Planning Commission, National Institute of Disaster Management, and National Disaster Management Act. Now we move on to another important framework of action, which is known as Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, which is a global blueprint for reducing disaster losses. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030 was adopted at the 3rd UN World Conference in Sendai, Japan on March 18, 2015. It is the outcome of a stakeholder consultations initiated in March 2012 and intergovernmental negotiations from July 2014 to March 2015, supported by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction at the request of the UN General Assembly. The Sendai framework is built on elements which ensure continuity with the work done by states and other stakeholders under the Hyogo Framework of Action and introduces a number of innovations as called for during the consultation and negotiations process. In 2016, Government of India released the country's first ever National Disaster Management Plan, a document based on the global blueprint for reducing disaster losses, that is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It aims to make India disaster resilient and significantly reduce the loss of lives and assets. The plan is based on the 4 priority themes of the Sendai Framework, namely understanding disaster risk, improving disaster risk governance, investing in disaster risk reduction through structural and non-structural measures, and disaster preparedness, early warning, and building back better in the aftermath of a disaster. Publication of the plan is further evidence of India's efforts to strengthen disaster risk governance, which included the establishment of a national platform for disaster risk reduction and the recognition of Minister of State for Home Affairs, Mr. Kiran Rijiju, as a United Nations integrated strategy for disaster reduction. He was the champion of disaster risk reduction. India's endeavor in the National Disaster Management Plan has been to take along all stakeholders in its efforts to build a disaster resilient India. India has fully embraced the Sendai Framework both in letter and in spirit while formulating the plan, and it reaffirms India's commitment to disaster risk reduction. India has set up a fine example to the rest of the world when it comes to political commitment to reducing disaster losses and managing disaster risk. The Government of India is one of the first in the world to come out publicly with a plan which seeks to implement the 4 priorities for action of the Sendai Framework, focused on spreading a greater understanding of disaster risk through education and public information, investing in disaster resilient infrastructure, and committing to improve disaster preparedness and building back better in recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction. The new plan covers all phases of disaster management from prevention and mitigation to response and recovery. It will also ensure that disaster risk reduction is folded into the work of all parts of the administration at all levels of the government. The plan has a regional approach which will be beneficial not only for disaster management but also for development planning. It is designed in such a way that it can be implemented in a scalable manner in all phases of disaster management. It also identifies major activities such as early warning, information dissemination, medical care, fuel, transportation, search and rescue, evacuation, etc. to serve as a checklist for agencies responding to a disaster. It also provides a generalized framework for recovery and offers flexibility to assess the situation and build back better. In addition, it is said the plan puts a focus on the need for greater information, education and communication activities in order to prepare communities to cope with the disasters. Now, what is the difference between Hyogo Framework and the Sendai Framework? This answers the second part of the question which I have discussed at the outset. The Sendai Framework is the successor instrument to the Hyogo Framework for Action 2005-2015. Second, the Hyogo Framework was the first plan which explained, described and detailed the work that is required from all different sectors and actors to reduce disaster losses. Third, Sendai Framework recognizes that the state has the primary role to reduce disaster risk, but that responsibility should be shared with other stakeholders including the local government, the private sector and other stakeholders. Fourth, the Hyogo Framework sets 5 priorities for action, the first 2 being governance and risk identification. Fifth, the Sendai Framework sets 4 priorities for action to be implemented at national and local levels and at global and regional levels. That is, understanding disaster risk. Second is strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. Third, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. Fourth, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Apart from these differences, I will also focus on some 2-3 specific points as well. Both this framework of action, Hyogo and Sendai, they are a multi-stakeholder inclusive approach to disaster risk reduction, although the Hyogo framework of action focused a lot more on a proactive approach, while the Sendai framework focused more on people-centric approach. Both focus on multiple levels of disaster risk reduction work from local to international. Also, Sendai framework emphasis on disaster risk, that is efforts to reduce the disaster size, whereas Hyogo focuses on disaster losses, that is minimizing the impacts of losses from the disaster. Second, Sendai focuses more on the implementation, means like how are we to prevent or stop the natural hazards. Hyogo focuses on the what, which implies understanding the risks and what must be done in response to those risks. So this completes the complete answer to the questions at the outset. That is all for now. Before signing off, do tune in to our next videos. Please share this video with your friends and subscribe in large numbers. We really appreciate your encouragement and constructive suggestions. Thanks till we meet again.